Isabella Cruz, a quiet waitress at May's Diner, bears deep, discolored scars from her past as a combat medic with the U.S. Marine Corps Echo 12 Division. She heroically rescued two Marines from a burning vehicle in Fallujah, sustaining severe injuries. Civilian life proved challenging, with job rejections due to her scars. May's Diner became her sanctuary, where she lived anonymously. One morning, a sneering businessman insulted her scars, suggesting she wasn't fit for her role. Isabella calmly retorted, "I've served men like you before, but in far worse places." This defiance, witnessed by patrons, would unexpectedly unveil her hidden valor and change everything. Isabella's powerful journey reminds us that true courage often wears the quietest face. If her story of resilience and hidden strength touched you, please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss another inspiring story that celebrates the dignity of every person and the unseen battles they carry with grace. A silver star. But Isabella never went to collect it. She didn't want the ceremony, the speeches, or the shallow gratitude from those who hadn't been there. What mattered to her were the lives saved, not the medals pinned. So she disappeared quietly from the military, just as she would from most people's memories. But not from the Marines. Never from them. The morning the businessman sneered at her in the diner, Isabella had already felt the stares, heard the silence that settled after his words. His gaze had lingered too long on the twisted skin that curled down her face and arm, as though it gave him permission to question her worth. But she hadn't flinched. Instead, she met him with a calm smile and words that cut deeper than any insult he could throw. "I've served men like you before, but in far worse places." The air had shifted after that, not just in the diner, but beyond its glass windows, where the world still held its breath in the soft blue of pre-dawn. When Isabella opened May's Diner the next morning, she didn't expect anything to be different. She did what she always did. She flicked on the old neon open sign, the red glow blinking against the dust-streaked window. The familiar scent of bleach and coffee still hung in the air, like memories never fully scrubbed clean. She tied on her faded apron, turned on the griddle, brewed the coffee, and let the quiet settle around her like armor. But outside, something had shifted. Figures began to emerge from the morning fog. First one, then another, then more. They came silently, each holding a small, cloth-wrapped token in their hands. They weren't strangers. Not to her. They were Marines. One by one, they entered the diner. Not for food, not for coffee, but for her. They came in uniform and out of it, some older, limping, some young and stiff-backed. One walked with a prosthetic leg, the same man she had pulled from a burning vehicle, who had once gripped her wrist with trembling fingers and begged her not to leave him. Another came with a child in his arms, his eyes filled with emotion he couldn't put into words. He was the father of the little girl who had once drawn Isabella a picture of a butterfly and said, "My daddy said you're a real hero." There was also the older Marine, whose son had once screamed in agony in the dirt as Isabella worked to stop the bleeding, refusing to let go until help arrived. And the young man who later named his firstborn, Thomas Isabella, because, as he told her in a hushed voice outside the diner once, "You gave me back my future." Even Margaret Benson, who hadn't worn a uniform herself but had carried the weight of war in other ways, stood by the door, eyes wet with something like reverence. And among them all stood Major Carter Brooks, upright and composed, but with a flicker of something raw and respectful in his gaze. He didn't salute, but his nod held the weight of 1,000 words. None of them said much. They didn't need to. Their presence, their quiet tokens, and the way they looked at Isabella spoke more than any speech or medal ever could. Isabella stood behind the counter, hands steady, eyes wide, heart pounding beneath her apron. For the first time in years, she felt something shift deep inside her. Not recognition, not even pride, but something more vulnerable and rare. Being seen. Not for her scars, not for her silence, but for the life she had lived, the lives she had saved, and the strength it took to keep going. The diner was no longer quiet. It buzzed with the breath of gratitude, of memories shared without words. The businessman, if he returned that morning, would have found no seat and no welcome. Because in that moment, Isabella Cruz wasn't just a scarred waitress. She was the heartbeat of something bigger. something unshakable. And the Marines, her Marines, they never forgot. She had vanished quietly after receiving the Purple Heart. Civilian life, however, offered no welcome parade. Each job interview turned into a dead end the moment her scars were noticed. Employers, trying to sound polite, would say she wasn't the right fit for public-facing roles. Eventually, the rejections chipped away at her until she just stopped trying. May's Diner was the first place that hadn't winced at the sight of her. Margaret Benson, the owner, hadn't asked any awkward questions or looked at her with pity. She simply asked, "Can you be here by 5 a.m.?" Isabella had nodded once. From that moment, the diner became her new battlefield, one of peace, not war. No one in that quiet town knew her history. No one could have guessed that the soft-spoken woman pouring their coffee had once cradled a man's artery between her fingers to keep him alive. They didn't know she had dragged wounded comrades from burning wreckage, that her hands, now gentle with cups and saucers, had once fired under the deafening roar of mortar blasts. To them, she was just Izzy, the silent, dependable one. The waitress who remembered every regular's name, every coffee preference, and who never once called in sick. But beneath that unassuming surface, Isabella Cruz carried a story forged in fire, duty, and unspoken sacrifice. And one morning, that story would walk right back into her life, unannounced, uninvited, speaking not through words, but through the silence of those who knew exactly what honor looked like. Tuesday mornings at May's Diner were usually a portrait of calm predictability. The regulars came in waves, truckers shaking off sleep, construction workers grabbing breakfast before the job site, a retired principal nursing coffee over crossword puzzles. They kept to their rhythms, nodding at Izzy, mumbling about the weather or last night's game. It was a place of small talk and quiet comfort. But not today. At 8:37 a.m., the front door jingled open and 3 men stepped in. Outsiders in crisp shirts and loosened ties, probably stopping in on their way to some business meeting in the city. Their expensive cologne clung to the air like smugness, and their laughter was too loud, slicing through the peaceful hum of conversation like a knife. They slid into the corner booth by the window, still talking as if no one else in the room mattered. Isabella approached them with her usual quiet poise, menus in one hand, coffee pot in the other. She said nothing, only nodded, setting down the menus and reaching forward to pour their coffee with practiced ease. The largest of the 3 stopped mid-sentence, his eyes locked onto the pale scars etched across her neck, trailing beneath the collar of her uniform. He stared too long, then he spoke, his voice intentionally loud. "You really think someone like you should be out here serving people?" he said, sneering. "Wouldn't dishwashing in the back be more appropriate?" The air shifted. His words clanged through the diner like a dropped tray. Forks paused. Coffee cups hovered halfway to lips. An older couple at booth 6 looked down at their plates. Behind the counter, the cook froze with a half-flipped pancake on the griddle. The diner held its breath. Isabella didn't flinch. Her face betrayed nothing. Calmly, she met his gaze, her voice steady and even. "I've served men like you before," she said, "but in far worse places." The man blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected a response. His companions chuckled, awkward, uneasy, trying to diffuse the tension. He leaned back in his seat, scoffing. "Don't tell me you were in the military," he said, his eyes sweeping over her scars with open disdain. "With that face, you wouldn't make it past the parking lot at recruitment." He laughed, but no one laughed with him. Not the waitress behind the register. Not the elderly man in the back booth. Not the trucker at table 4 who stood up silently, tossed a $10 bill on the table beside his half-eaten breakfast, and walked out the front door without a word. Isabella didn't respond. She simply moved on, pouring coffee into a regular's cup with hands that remained steady, except for the faintest tremble in her fingertips. Her face stayed composed, but her eyes swept across the room like she was scanning a perimeter, reading every expression like a battlefield report. Near the service counter, Margaret Benson had seen enough. She stepped quietly to Isabella's side and placed a hand gently on her arm. "You all right, Izzy?" she asked, voice low and full of concern etched deep into the lines of her weathered face. "I'm fine," Isabella replied, folding napkins with precise fingers. "I've dealt with worse in Fallujah." Margaret's jaw tightened. She squeezed Isabella's shoulder gently. You don't have to serve them. I can take it from here. But Isabella shook her head. No need, she said calmly. Some things you face head on. People are often afraid of what they can't grasp, and that's not her burden to fix. She didn't owe them an explanation. Without another word, she picked up the coffee pot and returned to the tables with quiet purpose. At the next booth, a man wearing a weathered Marine Corps cap gave her a small nod. He didn't speak. Instead, he left a $20 bill on a $5 tab. Their eyes met as he passed. No words were needed. In that brief moment, a silent understanding passed between them. A recognition, a bond forged not in conversation but in shared experience and mutual respect. Back at the corner booth, the group of businessmen had fallen uncharacteristically silent. No one could say if it was shame, discomfort, or both, but something had shifted. They hurried through the rest of their meal, left a stack of cash on the table, and exited without another glance. The tension hung in the air, like smoke after a fire. Maybe they didn't understand, maybe they never would. But they had seen her. That alone had weight. Later that same day, someone who'd witnessed the exchange shared it online. Just a simple story, no names, no photos, only a few paragraphs about a scarred waitress who responded to cruelty with grace and quiet strength, and a room full of people who, for the first time, truly looked at her. The post didn't vanish into the void. It was shared once, then 10 times, then 100. By nightfall, it had reached veterans groups across the country. But Isabella had no idea. She closed up as she always did, swept the floor, wiped down the counters, flipped the switch to turn off the neon open sign glowing in the window. Outside, the street lights blinked to life. Inside, one woman remained, scarred, steady, and carrying herself with a quiet dignity far beyond what the world often deserved. Tomorrow, life would carry on. But tomorrow, the world would remember her. Before she was Isabella Cruz, the quiet woman behind the counter at May's Diner, she had been Corman Cruz, a combat medic, a member of Echo 12, a Marine logistics unit stationed near Fallujah at the height of the Iraq War. She didn't enlist looking for glory. She joined because, after her brother was killed in Afghanistan, she couldn't stay home anymore. She was 23 years old, fueled by grief, stubbornness, and a fire in her chest that wouldn't go out. The recruiter had warned her, medics don't go looking for trouble. You won't be on the front lines. But in Iraq, trouble never waited for an invitation. Her job was to keep people breathing long enough to get them home. That meant working through chaos, bleeding bodies in the back of supply trucks, stabilizing soldiers in bomb craters, using her own belt as a tourniquet when the medkits ran dry. She became known for her calm, her hands steady as steel when everything else was falling apart. But nothing tested her like the mission in March 2010. Echo 12 had been rotating supplies between forward outposts when their convoy came under attack. Mortars rained down near Phoebe Courage, a base ringed by low walls and not nearly enough protection. Isabella had just finished checking supply inventory inside an armored transport when the first shell hit. She didn't hesitate. She dove for cover, counting the seconds between impacts, her ears filled with the scream of incoming fire. Smoke filled the sky, radio static hissed in her ear, and she could hear someone shouting over the chaos. One of the vehicles had taken a direct hit. She didn't wait for backup, didn't even take the time to throw on her body armor. She grabbed her medical pack and sprinted toward the smoke. 2 Marines were trapped inside the burning wreckage of the transport. The flames had already begun to twist the metal doors. 1 Marine was unconscious. The other was still conscious, but trapped under a twisted seat frame and screaming in agony. Isabella climbed in through a jagged hole in the side. Fire licked at the front cabin, the heat unbearable. Voices behind her screamed for her to stop. She didn't listen. She reached the first Marine, yanking him out by his flak jacket, dragging his limp body across the gravel as her boots began to melt from the scorched metal beneath her feet. She turned and went back in. She had just lifted the second Marine free when a secondary explosion ripped through the vehicle. The force flung her backward into a nearby concrete barrier. Her body hit hard, right arm first, and she tumbled, hitting the ground and rolling across the gravel. The air rushed out of her lungs. Pain bloomed in her chest. Her face felt like it was on fire. Her ears rang. The world went gray. After that, only fragments, the weight of blood soaking through her uniform, the stench of diesel and seared flesh, a voice shouting her name, then the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a medevac chopper cutting through the sky. She woke up 2 days later in a field hospital. Her right arm was bandaged. Her face was wrapped. A nurse hovered over her, whispering softly, "You made it." For weeks, she couldn't bear to look at her own reflection. The mirror became a stranger, a painful reminder of what she had lost. The skin grafts were still fresh and raw, her burns searing with every movement. The doctors had said she was lucky to still have function in her arm, but what haunted her wasn't the physical agony. It was the knowledge that there was no going back. The life she once knew had vanished in the smoke and fire. Before her discharge, her commanding officer came to see her one final time. His voice was firm, but there was something softer beneath the surface when he spoke. "You saved 2 lives that day," he said, handing her a citation for extraordinary valor under fire. She barely glanced at it. "You're not just a corpsman," he added. "You're the reason they made it home." She gave him a small nod, but the words didn't sink in. She had never worked for praise. She had just done her job the way she was trained to. When she was flown back to the States, there were no welcome banners waiting, no music, no speeches. The airstrip met her with silence. Just paperwork, cold formalities, and a cardboard box filled with everything she owned. Her uniform, her boots. A Purple Heart she didn't feel she deserved. Isabella Cruz left the military and settled in a quiet town tucked away in North Carolina, deliberately choosing a place far from the hum of military bases and the sterile halls of veterans' hospitals. She rented a small, plain apartment. No one in the town knew her past, and she didn't offer it. She found work at a local diner where customers didn't ask questions, and she welcomed that anonymity. Every day, she poured coffee, wiped down tables, and tried to vanish into the rhythm of ordinary life. But the war had followed her home. It clung to her like a second skin, in the way her fingers trembled just before the sun rose, in how she startled awake at the first crack of thunder, in the silence that came over her when someone touched her scarred arm. She didn't hide the burns, but she never explained them either. She became a mystery to the town, the quiet woman who moved with too much precision, who always wore short sleeves no matter the weather, who never cried and never smiled too wide. To most, she was a stranger. But to the Marines of Echo 12, she was the reason they were alive. She never asked for gratitude, never sought it. But years later, it would find her all the same. Not in the form of thanks, but as a reminder. A reminder of who she had been when the fire surged around them and she had chosen to stay, while others turned away. That morning, the air had an unusual chill. A fine mist hung low over the town, the streets still hushed, the day barely waking. Inside May's diner, Isabella moved the same as always, calm, focused, every motion clean and deliberate. At exactly 6 a.m., she flipped the sign to open, expecting nothing more than another routine Tuesday. Coffee, eggs, small talk, the usual. But the world outside had shifted. Across the street, a line had formed, men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, stretching past the corner and out of sight. Some wore jeans and windbreakers, others dressed in plain black coats. But there was something in their bearing. The way their backs were straight, their hands clasped behind them, the quiet discipline etched into every stance, that told her the truth. They were Marines, and each one held a small cloth-wrapped object. At first, Isabella didn't understand. The first man to step inside was tall, his hair streaked with gray at the temples, eyes aged by deserts and decades. He moved to the counter and took a seat, nodding at her with a quiet familiarity. "Black coffee," he said, his voice steady, then added more gently, "You don't remember me, do you?" She tilted her head slightly. His voice reached for something buried deep inside her memory. He gave a faint smile. "Major Carter Brooks. Echo 12, you dragged me out of that fire." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard that name in years. He reached into his coat and placed a small green bundle on the counter. "I'm not here for breakfast," he said. "I came to return something." Inside the cloth was a weathered Echo 12 medallion. The metal was scratched and dulled by time and sand, but unmistakable. "We've been looking for you," he said. "A private recognized you last week," said another voice. His captain, stepping up behind him. "They still carried your photo from the field hospital. You were working on everyone else while your arm was already burnt." Isabella couldn't speak. Her eyes flooded, blurring everything around her. She gave a small nod, unable to say a word. Outside, the line moved slowly, but it never stopped. One by one they entered. Each Marine brought something: a letter, a unit patch, a photo, a coin, pieces of their lives she had helped preserve. Some hugged her tightly, others could only offer a silent nod, tears streaking their faces as their throats closed with unspoken emotion. A young man with a prosthetic leg stepped forward. "You probably don't remember me," he said, placing a coin into her palm. "But I remember you. You kept pressure on my leg while I screamed and cursed. Then you told me a dumb joke about a camel and a sandwich." I laughed. That laugh saved me. Another Marine, older, quietly handed her a folded letter. "My son was one of the ones you pulled from that burning truck," he said, voice shaking. "He's got 3 kids now. They wouldn't exist if not for you." By 10 a.m., the crowd hadn't dwindled. The little diner that had once been her hiding place had become something else. A quiet shrine to courage, memory, and the enduring bond of those who had faced fire together and survived. By midday, word had spread like wildfire through the veteran community nationwide. The video taken by a truck driver early that morning had gone viral. He'd captured the growing line outside the diner and uploaded it with a single caption: "She was mocked yesterday. Today the Marines came for her." And they truly had. More veterans showed up, some traveling from hours away, across counties and state lines. Families of fallen soldiers came too. Parents, siblings, spouses, clutching framed photos of sons and daughters who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with her in battle. Isabella hadn't eaten. She hadn't rested. From the moment the doors opened, she stood at the counter, welcoming each visitor with quiet dignity, as though every handshake and every whispered thank you was part of a sacred ritual. She never asked for this, but she met it with the grace of someone who had long carried a burden few could truly understand. A little girl, maybe 9 years old, approached with her father beside her. The man bent down slightly, speaking softly. "She wanted to thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "At night she hears stories about you. You're her hero." The girl reached up and handed Isabella a small crayon drawing. In shaky, colorful lines, it showed a woman wearing a cape, carrying someone out of a burning building. Isabella's breath caught. No gasps, no sobs, just a quiet tremble in a single exhaling that seemed to carry years of silent grief. Tears traced down her cheeks without sound, born not of pain, but of a deep, quiet acknowledgement. By day's end, the donation jar at the register, labeled Veteran Support Services, was overflowing, packed with folded bills and handwritten notes. Nobody brought up the men from the day before. They didn't have to. This wasn't about payback. It wasn't about humiliation or setting the record straight. It was about honoring something deeper: sacrifice, dignity, memory. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Isabella Cruz no longer felt like she was fading into the background. She wasn't seen because of her scars, but because of what she had survived carrying them, and the lives she had saved along the way. 2 days later, the soft jingle of the bell over May's diner sounded again. This time it rang with hesitation, almost as though the door itself didn't want to announce them. The 3 businessmen returned. Gone was the swagger, the smugness they'd once cloaked themselves in like designer suits. They moved awkwardly now, as though their bodies were foreign to them. The man who had ridiculed Isabella's scars clutched his hat tightly in both hands, nervously twisting it. He looked lost. The diner fell still, but the silence wasn't born of fear. It was expectation. Every regular paused, every Marine lingered over lukewarm coffee. Every local who had read the story or seen the footage online turned slightly to watch. Isabella stood behind the counter, drying a glass. Her face was calm, unreadable. Not cold, just quietly waiting. The man cleared his throat. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said, the once confident cadence of his voice now shaky and small. "I judged you. I didn't know anything about you, what you'd been through, what you gave." A long silence followed. Even the hum of the coffee machine seemed to hold its breath. Isabella set the glass down gently, walked slowly over to the counter by the register, and tapped her finger once lightly on the donation jar. She said nothing, but she didn't have to. The man understood. He reached into his pocket, took out a folded stack of bills, and without a word slid them into the jar. It joined the many others given not out of pity, but out of reverence. Respect wasn't something you said, it was something you showed. Isabella looked him in the eyes. Hers were steady, quiet, kind, and she gave him a single nod, small but unmistakable, a nod of recognition, a nod of forgiveness. Not because she needed to hear his apology. She had long since moved beyond needing validation. It was a gesture that said, "I see you've changed. Now go and do better." The three men left with their heads bowed, and inside the diner, life resumed. The sounds returned, coffee pouring, forks clinking against ceramic plates, voices rising again, but softer this time, gentler. Margaret Benson leaned in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed and a quiet smile tugging at her lips. "You could have kept that money," she said later as they were closing up. "Lord knows you earned every cent of it." Isabella didn't answer right away, but when she did, it was with a smile, real and full, not the tight, guarded one she'd worn for years, but one that seemed to light her from within. "No," she said simply, "it belongs to all of them, every hand still reaching for a better world." And as the days rolled on, that ripple of change spread far beyond the little diner. At the local high school, the principal had a plaque installed in the counseling office. It read, "Respect all scars, seen and unseen." At the VA clinic down the road, a framed photo of Isabella standing behind the counter went up in the front lobby. Beneath it, a simple caption, "Courage isn't always loud." Other shops followed suit. Small signs appeared in windows, messages of gratitude, statements of solidarity, and everywhere reminders that what Isabella carried wasn't just the memory of war, it was the quiet strength of survival. May's Diner wasn't just a place for pancakes and bottomless coffee anymore. Over time, it had become something much more, a haven, quiet and steady, for anyone carrying wounds too deep to see. It welcomed the scarred, the lost, the ones still trying to piece themselves back together. Some nights, long after the clatter of dishes faded and the last customers had gone, Isabella would sit by the window nursing a cup of coffee, her eyes following the way the streetlights danced on the sidewalk outside. That's when the memories would stir, of the little girl who had gifted her a crayon drawing, the Marines who had shaken her hand with reverence, and the elderly man who had wordlessly placed his Purple Heart on the counter and whispered, "You gave me another chance." In those moments of stillness, Isabella came to understand something she hadn't put into words before. She hadn't just made it out of that fire all those years ago. She had become the fire, a quiet, persistent flame that refused to die, no matter how cold the world had been. Her scars weren't symbols of defeat. They were declarations of resilience, of strength earned the hardest way. And now the world was beginning to see her that way too. The invitation arrived in the middle of a chilly afternoon, hand-delivered to May's Diner. A plain envelope, but inside it a card embossed with golden lettering, an invitation to a ceremony in honor of Isabella Cruz. It had been signed by several former members of Echo 12. At first, Isabella stared at it, unsure. It had been years since she'd worn a dress, even longer since she'd stood in front of any kind of audience. Her instinct was to retreat. But then came the phone call. Major Carter Brooks, his voice low but unmistakably resolute, asked her personally to come. And somehow, despite the uncertainty tightening in her chest, Isabella found herself saying yes. The ceremony took place at the local VFW hall, a simple brick structure just a short walk from the diner. On the night of the event, Isabella chose a modest black dress. She left her hair down for the first time in over 10 years, letting it fall naturally past her shoulders. She made no attempt to conceal the scars that traced their way along her jaw and neck. Tonight they would be seen. When she entered the hall, the entire room stood. Marines in full-dress blues, veterans in worn civilian jackets dotted with insignia and patches, families with children in tow. Over 200 people turned toward her. They weren't standing out of formality. They were standing out of deep respect. Isabella stopped for a breath, the sight washing over her like a tide. She might have faltered, but Margaret Benson stepped forward and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Go on, honey," she said softly. "This is your family too." Major Brooks met her halfway down the aisle. When he spoke, his voice rang with emotion, barely kept in check. "We spent 7 years looking for Isabella Cruz," he said to the assembled crowd. "After her discharge, she vanished, just like so many wounded warriors do. Some of us feared the worst." He paused, his throat tight. "But she didn't disappear. She rebuilt. She carried others, helped heal what no medicine could, and she may never know the full extent of what she's given." And then one by one, those she had saved stepped forward. A man who now coached his son's little league team, alive because Isabella had pulled him from the blast zone. A woman who became a nurse, remembering how Isabella's hands had never once trembled, not even when hers had. A retired colonel who raised a photo of his 3 grandchildren with quiet pride and said simply, "They're here because of you." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes and slid down her cheeks, trailing gently along the faded lines of her scars. She didn't try to hide them. When it was her turn to speak, she approached the podium and stood in silence for a long, waited moment. The room waited with her, breathing in time with her stillness. No one rushed, no one urged. Finally, she spoke, softly, steadily. "I never thought of myself as special," she began. "I just did what needed doing when the moment came." She reached up and lightly touched the scars along her neck, her fingers tracing them like a map of old truths. "These aren't marks of tragedy," she said. "They're reminders that when the fire came, I stepped forward. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was, and still chose to act." The applause that followed wasn't loud or frantic. It was rhythmic, heartfelt, the kind of clapping that settles deep into your chest and stirs something buried. It wasn't celebration, it was recognition. Then Major Brooks stepped forward again. In his hands was a shadow box containing several objects. Her long-lost Purple Heart, a unit commendation that had been approved but never delivered, and a new plaque, commissioned just for this occasion, acknowledging her valor in the face of fire. "Isabella Cruz," he said, Echo 12. As the room exhaled around her, a young Marine approached. Older now, more grounded, someone Isabella only vaguely remembered from the past. In his arms, he held a baby, barely a year old. "We named him Thomas Isabella," he said shyly, looking up at her. "So he always remembers what courage looks like." After the crowd had dispersed and the lights dimmed to a soft hush, Isabella remained where she was, unmoving for a few moments longer. Her footsteps echoed gently as she made her way to the front of the room, where the American flag hung motionless above the rows of medals, their surfaces catching the low light in quiet glimmers. She stood there, still, eyes fixed on the display. And in that silence, for the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel it. Not the relief of having made it through, not simply the absence of war, but a quiet, unshakable pride. It wasn't just pride in surviving the unimaginable. It was something deeper. Pride in having served, in the lives she had touched, in the silent, lasting legacy she had created without even realizing it. The pain, the memories, the physical and emotional scars, once things she had buried deep, no longer felt like shameful remnants of a life she wished to forget. Now they felt like something else entirely. Proof of a battle endured, proof of courage summoned when the world was crumbling, proof of a woman who didn't run from the fire, but into it, because someone had to, and she chose to be that someone. And in that still moment, Isabella knew in the very marrow of her being that she had never truly been forgotten. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply been waiting, patiently, quietly, for the right moment to reemerge, to step once again into the light she had more than earned. Isabella Cruz's journey stands as a quiet, powerful reminder that true courage doesn't always shout. It doesn't always wear a uniform you notice, or come wrapped in a story everyone hears. Sometimes it walks beside us in silence. Its strength hidden in the calm of a voice, the grace in a step, the kindness in a weary smile. In a world that so often judges at a glance, Isabella was a living, breathing reminder that scars, whether they can be seen or not, are not marks of weakness. They are the evidence of survival, of strength, of a sacrifice so profound that it asks for nothing in return. Not praise, not sympathy, not recognition, just the dignity of being seen. In today's world where speed and noise often drown out the quiet truths, it's far too easy to overlook the everyday heroes among us. Veterans who have returned home and now work ordinary jobs. Neighbors who smile at us, though they carry the weight of invisible wars. People whose struggles have shaped their souls in silence. They are everywhere, and their stories are not meant to be glanced at and forgotten. They deserve to be remembered, to be honored. Maybe the question we need to ask ourselves is this: how many times have we looked at someone and passed judgment without knowing what they've had to overcome just to stand there? And how many lives have been quietly molded, uplifted, and even saved by people we never even noticed? If Isabella's journey moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your life who carries their burdens with silent grace, we invite you to share their name or even their story in the comments below. Let us give them the honor they deserve. Thank you for walking through this story with us. If you believe in the power of quiet strength, in the courage that doesn't clamor for applause, and in the quiet dignity of the human spirit, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell so you'll never miss another story that matters. And always remember, the strongest souls are often the ones who carry both their scars and their kindness without ever asking to be seen.